It's been a while since I watched Blue Lock's first season, but it was every bit as good as I remember it. Blue Lock is a genuinely phenomenal series, and one which is very unique in some of its themes and messages too. There's a lot to analyse, and I'll cover the story itself too for anyone who hasn't watched it or just wants a reminder. So I'm not going to waste any more time on an introduction here. The title and thumbnail already told you exactly what this video is, so going straight into the first season. And Blue Lock has possibly the best episode 1 that I've seen in a series. It's certainly a very strong contender for that spot. It starts off introducing the idea of an egoist versus a more normal footballer in its very first minute, although we don't know that on our first watch through. It starts with just a regular high school football match, with our protagonist 1-0 down but making his way upfield. However, once he gets in front of goal with nothing but the keeper in front of him, he chooses to pass instead of shoot. His teammate misses, causing his team to lose the match and not qualify for nationals. But this is something that I think a good number of us would have done, either due to it being the safer option or due to the fear of others' reactions if we messed up here. But as a result of this, he can only watch on in jealousy as Kira, the opponent's striker, scores himself and even gets a TV interview afterwards. And he comes across as, the picture of sportsmanship and friendliness. And on first watch through, he seems like he's set up to be the rival that the protagonist will defeat at the very end of the series, But, of course, Blue Lock is not your ordinary series. And we see this in the immediate aftermath where Isagi's coach is saying, it doesn't matter if we lost, we're still a great team and the time wasn't wasted. But Isagi just outright disagrees. The feel-good speech did nothing for him because of his insatiable hunger for more. Of course, in real life, that can be both a blessing and a curse. But I love the way in the anime they show it as this kind of dark thought hidden from everyone else. I think a lot of his thoughts throughout the show are ones that we've kind of had but never really wanted to admit, Even down to his dream of winning the World Cup and becoming the best player in the world. I've not played football for a good decade now, but I think almost every young guy dreams of exactly that at some point, But Isagi's always been taught that that's wrong, that he should focus more on his teamwork than his individual skill and accomplishments, that just participating is what matters, and he shouldn't be frustrated at defeat. So he bottles it all down. He doesn't show it externally. But on his way back from the game, he can't help but let all that frustration out. He starts screaming and crying in sort of the middle of this public park. But again, as soon as he gets home and his parents asked about it, he doesn't show any of it. And, done in the wrong way, this can obviously be quite counterproductive, but what if there was a right way to use those feelings? A resourceful way? One that actually benefits you instead of just consuming you and making you resentful? Enter Jinpachi Ego. To Isagi's disbelief, he receives an invitation to an exclusive training camp for the nation's top players, where he encounters Kira once again, and they, exchange some friendly small talk, compliment each other, etc. But then Jinpachi walks in, and no one knows who this guy is. But what's particularly interesting is that his first speech before any objections from the audience makes no mention of the idea of ego or anything like that. It's only after he hears the disagreement that he does so, as though he kind of just expected everyone to go along with it. It's simply, we're going to win the World Cup, but to do so, I need one of you 300 to become a revolutionary striker. This facility is designed for exactly that, and he makes the particularly bold claim that the winner of the 300 will become the greatest striker, whilst also sliding in the fact that the other 299 will all be losers. There will be no power of teamwork and friendship here. And his idea is met by pretty fierce disapproval from the gathered strikers, except Isagi, who stays very quiet, but then finds himself starting to disagree once everyone else around him does, as though he's given into the idea of this is crazy, despite not really being fully convinced it is, as after all, who wouldn't want to be the greatest striker in the world? It's just that it seems so laughable to everyone there that this weird-looking stranger could help them do so. But his response is one of my favourite ideas in Blue Lock, as he talks about how they've all kind of put this mental limit on the heights they can reach, just trying to be the best in their local area rather than the world, and that will limit the actual heights they reach. And you see this idea everywhere. You know, the most famous historical example, I promise this is the only history lesson in this video, but the 4-minute mile, right? A barrier believed to be humanly impossible for close to a century until a man named Roger Bannister broke it by 0.6 of a second. 46 days later, it was broken again. And since then it's been broken countless times, all because the idea of it being humanly impossible shattered. And we see that come up a lot in this series. We then get Jinpachi's bit about how the very best strikers in the world care far more about themselves than their team. And on first watch, I felt like I kind of already understood everything the show was going to tell me. Like, yeah, sometimes you need to put yourself first, cool, but boy, was I wrong. Because Isagi's right, like, no one tells us these kind of things, that you can reach these crazy heights, that you can have this much confidence in yourself. And obviously the idea of that is extremely scary, especially for someone like Isagi with no previous major accomplishments to speak of. But when Ego tells everyone to imagine that same situation Isagi was in before, with the game on the line in front of an open goal, with a teammate to the side, except this time it's the World Cup on the line, what would they do? Does Isagi want to go down that same route again? Or does his gut tell him otherwise, that Jinpachi is speaking some truth here, that he should disregard his common sense, or the common sense drilled into him up to this point anyway, to step forward into the crazy world of Blue Lock, to live for his own accomplishments before anything else. And that to Jinpachi is what it means to be a striker. And Isagi, tired of how he's been living so far, decides that if that's what it takes, he will do it. And he's the first one to break free from the crowd and charge in. But he's far from the last, as everyone else there very quickly follows. And it's pretty likely that a lot of them thought the same, they just didn't want to be the first one. But to Ego's amusement, they all rush through regardless, to the place where the game is the hottest in the world. Now, the anime jumps past the part where Isagi's thinking to himself on the bus, so this didn't really click for me the first time, but when you look at the manga, it hits you that they got all hyped up, sprinted through these doors yelling, just to have to kind of orderly queue to get onto these buses, you know, and have to wait to get off at the other end, which is pretty funny to imagine, you know, the slight awkwardness where they're all just standing around waiting to get on. But anyway, because of that, they've all calmed down a bit by the time they get there. They get their uniforms, and then they all meet up in this big room, and we get a little snapshot of some of the major characters' personalities. Kunigami's seriousness and muscles, Bachira's weirdness, I'm sorry, but there's no other word for this. Why are you asleep on the floor? And of course, the greatest character of all, Igaguri. He speaks of his incredibly moving backstory. Him being ranked 300 is only proof how flawed and fabricated these rankings are. No, but seriously, I do actually love this guy. I'm probably his only fan in the world, but I really do love this character. But that's for a separate video. Jinpachi says hi and informs everyone that their numbers correlate to their rank, meaning Isagi is second last. And every time I mention this, someone always comments saying, yeah, but the ranks were fake, so he wasn't actually second last. Yes, but at this point in time, he doesn't know that. So you can imagine the absolute horror he felt at seeing that, and it only makes what happens next even crazier. The stakes are raised even higher, with Ego announcing that the top 5 will play in the U20 World Cup, whereas the losers will never be allowed to represent Japan. And I don't think that everyone is still fully convinced that he has the authority to enforce either of these things, but regardless, with that out of the way, rather than any sort of conventional football, we have a game tag lasting 136 seconds, due to that apparently being the average time each player spends with the ball per game. The timer starts, some players freak out, some even try to escape, but not our shining hero Igaguri. who, without a moment's hesitation, immediately steps forward. No, but on a serious note, he's one of the first to openly acknowledge, it's either me or you guys, so it's gonna have to be one of you because I'm putting my goal before yours. Whereas by comparison, Kira comments on how he actually disagrees with Ego and intends to prove him wrong. Igaguri manages to tag Kunigami, who then tags Isagi and wins him in the process with just 1 minute left on the clock. He frantically dashes around, desperate to change his fate, and it falls right in front of him. The character renowned for his good luck gets bad luck as his ankle twists, and Kira, who so defiantly stood against Jinpachi's philosophy, immediately yells at Isagi to go for it, a point that I'll come back to. And Isagi walks towards him, trying to push down all his feelings of guilt at targeting the injured player, but soon accepting the obvious truth. It's either him or you. And I expected this to be the twist the first time I watched Blue Lock. The well-mannered, polite main character accepting the slightly darker side of himself and giving in to Jinpachi's philosophy. And that would have made for an interesting series. But what makes Blue Lock a phenomenal series is that he doesn't do it. And this is still one of my favorite scenes in the whole series. And it's what makes this such a phenomenal episode 1. He doesn't do it. And why? Well, because that's something he can already do. That's something his old self can do. And if he only does things he believes he can already do, even if he gets these short-term successes, nothing will change in the long run. He won't evolve as a striker and as a person. Like, sure, he'll pass this round and feel a bit relieved at doing so, but that's not who he wants to be, Mr. 299, just scraping by. And so he turns away, saying, if I don't beat someone stronger than me, nothing will change, putting faith in himself that he can do so. And I already thought this was hype as fuck, but the series goes a step further, and Bachira tackles him. This took me a moment to process the first time I watched it, that he's intentionally tagged himself. And I think this is where I realized that this show is going to go way beyond my expectations for it, as Bachira turns his sight on the highest ranked player there, Kira. And if those two twists weren't enough, you know exactly what happens next, the biggest one of all. Bachira, unable to pin Kira down himself, with 4 seconds on the clock, passes the ball to Isagi, who has no logical reason to do anything besides step out of the way. That's all he has to do to survive, but he's already proven he wants more than that. So as the clock hits 3 and he has no time to think or process anything, Isagi goes with his gut feeling and brutally eliminates Kira. Surprised at himself at the decision to do so, he's horrified and filled with guilt as he apologizes, but Kira erupts in anger. And don't get me wrong, I'd be pretty mad too, right? But he talks about how he shouldn't be the one eliminated. His future doesn't deserve to be erased, and that if anyone's gonna go, it should be Igaguri. And firstly, back off Igaguri, bro, okay? Secondly, beneath that polite persona, he clearly saw himself as better than everyone else around him. He then turns his fury to Isagi and leaves the room, as Isagi reluctantly accepts that he actually really enjoyed that. He's pumped up, but he doesn't want to admit that. He feels quite guilty at feeling that way, and so he deflects the blame to Bachira. But Jinpachi encourages it. He even tells them it's necessary, that they should etch this feeling of victory into their brains. And at this point in time, he really does seem a bit unhinged. I still didn't feel like I particularly liked this guy, but of course, as the show goes on, that starts to change, because it becomes increasingly clear that there's a lot more depth to what he said. And whilst we're on the topic of him, I honestly think the reason Blue Lock is able to talk about all these ideas without it coming across as cringe or overly edgy is because of Jinpachi ego. Because you can probably imagine how if all of the ideas he says about ego etc. originally came from one of the players themselves, it'd probably feel a bit jarring, a bit cringe, Certainly if someone like Rin was the first to start talking about it, then it would just seem quite edgy. But what I think makes it work so well is that Jinpachi is the one telling the rest of them to, put themselves first more, etc. He's doing it because he genuinely believes it to be the best thing for them, because he wants them to succeed and knows what he's saying will benefit them. And I think that's why Blue Lock has been able to pull off all the philosophies it does so well and make us genuinely reflect on them. It's because it all stems from a character who isn't saying it because of an ego in the more common definition of the word outside the series. And then we get to watch the way that such a variety of characters respond to it and utilize it, rather than the ones saying it all. It is also obviously that it's much more refined and nuanced than just ego good, be selfish, But I do also think that having Jinpachi be the one to originate it all is what allows Blue Lock to be what it is and be so interesting. But anyway, returning to the story itself, with the tag out the way, Team Z is formed. The 11 survivors will now all be on a team together. So moving ahead, we have the physical drills, where we see Isagi really struggling in comparison to everyone else, and also Kuon being the helpful, polite guy. Very intentionally done. It's the author's way of almost kind of mocking the guys that appear very polite but are extremely slimy beneath the surface, as we'll come back to later. And I think it's well within his rights to do so, personally. But anyway, there's also a cool little bit of foreshadowing here with Naruhaya grabbing some of the food from Gagamaru's blind spot. But the main point of all of this is Isagi hasn't just made this one bold choice and reached the level of everyone else, right? It's going to take a lot more than just a one-off burst of action. So, restless and unable to sleep, Bachira and Isagi decide to do some training together, where Isagi asks him about why Bachira put his faith in Isagi back then, to which Bachira responds that he has a monster inside of him, and he thinks Isagi has one too. Isagi doesn't have a clue what he's talking about, and neither do we at this point. I was honestly wondering the first time I watched this, if there was going to be some sort of weird monster-based power system introduced. So glad there wasn't, but we get our first glimpse into the brilliance of Isagi as a player. He's even willing to entertain and consider this pretty absurd idea. Obviously he knows that Bachira, well, probably at least isn't being literal, so the idea of a monstrous impulse from within isn't completely impossible. And so he doesn't dismiss it as just nonsense the way some people would. Anything that improves his chances, he'll at the very least consider seriously. Whereas Bachira, on the other hand, seems to go against a lot of what Jinpachi says, despite him actually praising Bachira as exactly what he was looking for. But he's super friendly and talks about how he's glad he came to Blue Lock because he gets to meet Isagi and play football with him, which completely goes against Jinpachi's hunt for a singular striker, one who would trample on the other 299 to reach the top. But we'll come back to that. The following day, Igaguri finds out his rank is 275 and Isagi's is 274. And you'd think it'd be obvious to them why they've moved up 25 ranks given they just saw someone eliminated and 12 times 25 is 300, but apparently not. So Jinpachi informs them of this and announces the first selection's rules. But before that, we jump away to Sai Itoshi, who's being interviewed about playing for Japan. But he says that he'd rather die than do that. He's a 17-year-old professional midfielder, putting him outside of Blue Lock's scope. But in a similar fashion to Jinpachi, he talks about his disdain for the Japanese team, and in particular, their strikers, which makes Jinpachi seem a little less insane and far more grounded in reality, as it's no longer just him making these claims. There's a highly regarded professional player as well. He passes by a press conference where the media are outraged at the project, and I really like the way that Blue Lock shows the people outside of it just not understanding it whatsoever. That just makes perfect sense to me. There's no way they'd ever accept any sort of explanation as to why this is happening, except Sai, whose eyes burn with excitement at this prospect. And again, shows us in the audience that of all the outsiders in this room, the only guy who agrees with it is Sai, the one who is by far the most qualified, in fact the only person who probably is qualified to make a judgment on it. And so again it adds this growing feeling of Jinpachi must be right. Anyway, going back to the first selection's rules, it's simply 5 teams of 11. The only 2 caveats being, these 11 strikers will have to decide who plays where, including in goal. The reason being is to rewrite all previous knowledge of positions, strategies, and formations the players have. He's not just undoing their previous programming, I suppose, for lack of a better word, of you should act this way, be this way, think this way, etc., but also the way they play the game itself. Both on and off the pitch, he wants everything to restart from zero. But there's one last twist. It won't just be the top 2 teams progressing, but the top scorer from the bottom 3 teams as well. It's just like those quotes from those top players that he gave. Even if your team loses, as long as you do well, you're still rewarded. And so, after some rock, paper, scissors to decide the goalie, the first match begins against Team X, where we meet Barou. And the other 10 players on his team, those guys, they're real important, yeah. Which is obviously entirely intentional. They're supporting actors for the man who seemed to embody Jinpachi's ideals, as we'll come back to in a few seconds. The game begins and quickly devolves into an absolute free-for-all, with players tackling their own team as they seem to exclusively focus on the top scorer part and forget that just winning the game gets them through. And that's our first reaction, right? What are you guys doing? If you work as a team and it goes well, at least one of you will score and the rest of you will still get a win, so that's surely a better plan than this, right? But then the king breaks through, and we're going to be talking a lot about this guy in this video, but he effortlessly scores and sets a whole new standard of skill for a striker. He's filled to the brim with confidence in himself, and his team is united in their praise of him, whereas Team Z immediately descends into argument, blaming each other and claiming they should be the one to get the ball. But they had their chance and none of them did anything with it. So what's the difference between them and Barou? It seems like it's just their raw skill. If they'd been able to score, the inverse would have likely happened. But as Barou only continues to score, the arguments only intensify and Team Z becomes more desperate, whereas Team X only becomes more unified. However, if you remember Isagi's moment at the end of episode 1, that if he just takes the easy route, sure he'll survive this, but nothing will change. He'll end up the same as he did before and inevitably face elimination. This is an idea that comes up multiple times in the series, and is of course what happens to Team X, who lose every single game following this one. The rest of Team X is intentionally written with absolutely nothing memorable about them for this exact reason. They accepted their roles as supporting actors and paid the price for it. Anyway, we'll come back to that. The score ends up at 5-0, and it's clearly over for Team Z, but Batra and Isagi want just one goal: to unify the team and recover their morale leading into the following matches. Between the two of them, they're able to slip past most of Team X, but right when Isagi thinks he's through on goal, Barou shows up to stop him. And Isagi doesn't think himself capable of getting past. He finds himself wanting to shoot, as that's what a striker would do, but in a moment of realization, he can see that passing will lead to a goal, and so Kunigami gets the ball and makes it 5-1. But Barou is utterly disgusted by this, calling Isagi talentless and claiming that he's not cut out to be a striker. And to hear what's likely the best player Isagi has encountered in his life say this is a major confidence blow, as he ends the match reflecting on his decision and frustrated that he hasn't changed as much as he thought. He spends the time in between this and the next match reflecting on his skill set and trying to figure out what he could use to help Team Z. Following Ego's rant about how they all need a weapon, something they specialize and excel in, the rest of Team Z lists off all of theirs, and everyone is able to name something aside from 2 players, although I suppose you could count Igaguri as a third, who just says his is fighting spirit in absence of anything else. But Isagi doesn't know, and Chigiri doesn't want to say it, which just seems odd in this pit of hyped up athletes that he doesn't have any interest in it. Obviously we know why. as we'll come back to. But also notice that Kuon is the one to try and organize the team together and comes up with this rotating tactic. He also claims he was up all night thinking of the name, which, looking back, was likely him deciding whether or not to go with his other scheme that we see later on. But anyway, moving ahead, we then get Kunigami's conversation with Isagi, and Kunigami is just so wholesome. You know, he's the one guy who thanked Isagi for the goal instead of blaming him, which obviously he's the one who scored, but regardless, he talks about how he wants to become a football player because he saw them as basically superheroes growing up. You know, their courage, their passion, the joy and inspiration they bring to the stadiums that they play in. That's who he wants to be. It's what he wants to embody. He's this kind of beacon of sportsmanship and friendliness in an otherwise very intense, dark environment. And he also discusses Isagi's weapon with him, noting that Raichi was actually in a better position at the time. Isagi's decision to pass means that he factored in Kunigami's talent for mid-range shots in that split-second calculation, and that could be his weapon. And with that, let's move into the match against Team Y, who lost their last game 8-0. Team Z's initial attacks are easily defended by Team X, and swiftly turned into a counterattack that puts them 1-0 down. Doubt begins to settle in for Team Z, who, at half-time, don't seem to have a valid plan of attack. But in the second half, when they get a corner, Isagi instead makes a beeline towards a player that had previously completely flown under the radar, Nico. All eyes were on Oikawa as he was the goal scorer, but Nico was the one enabling it all. And his successful interception here is the first bit of evidence towards Kunigami's theory that Isagi's weapon is his ability to sniff out a goal, but this time using it defensively, although quickly turning it into offense. Isagi's shot is blocked, but Gagamaru manages to equalize. But regardless, Nico is set up to be Isagi's new rival, with them both having similar strengths in their ability to see opportunities. The game seems to stabilize for a bit until the final minutes where Team Y sends every single member forward to attack, resulting in Nico getting past everyone to end up 1-1 against the goalkeeper. But he passes to Oikawa, the exact same way Isagi did in episode 1 and lived to regret it. Team Z is filled with despair, but Isagi sees right through it and shows up in the exact right place just in time. Right now, Isagi is the same as Nico, he would have passed there as well, but now he actually gets it. Someone who does that, who can't have faith in themselves to score in those kind of situations, is not cut out to be a striker. Isagi still regrets that time that he passed. He doesn't want to be that way anymore. He wants to discard that old version of himself, and he wastes no time in doing so, immediately charging away from Nico, who currently represents that old side of Isagi left behind in regret. Team Z charge up the field as Batris goes past the defenders, and his cross finds Isagi, who proudly declares himself a striker as he nails home the winning goal. His team erupts in celebration, but he's not interested in that. What he's interested in is the state Nico is in, who's crying in the same way Isagi did after his decision to pass in episode 1. And Isagi can't help but feel pumped up. He loves that feeling, you know, as I said earlier, it's a little bit fucked up, but it's also quite human. You know, obviously these two are kind of trash talking each other all game, like it's pretty understandable he feels the way at the end of it. But anyway, with that, the second match concludes, and their next opponent will be Team W, who also have one win and one loss. However, their win was over Team X, who Team Z lost 5-1 to. And so understandably, they're pretty concerned over it. Later that night, Isagi can't sleep yet again. He's too hyped over his goal and resting with feelings of guilt over his joy at Nico's expression. So he heads to the monitoring goal to rewatch that goal, relive that memory, only to find Chiguri there doing exactly that. Except the memories he's reliving aren't from earlier that day. They're from over a year prior, before he got injured. Obviously, we don't know that at the start of the scene, but Isagi's still curious as to what this guy's weapon is and why he won't reveal it. So he keeps pestering him until eventually Chiguri opens up. He tore his right ACL about a year ago, and the doctors told him that one more injury like that would be the end of him. So even though it's been a year, he still can't play the way he used to. So the two immediate questions that come to our mind are, if you can't play properly anymore, why did Jinpachi invite you here? And secondly, why would you then accept? He says he used to also have sleepless nights after a goal and also dreamt of being the greatest striker, just like Isagi. But now he's afraid of getting injured yet again and losing that dream for good. And he says this is because of Isagi's football. This still doesn't make much sense to us just yet, because again, if he's not going to play properly, that dream is surely already dead. He says he came to Blue Lock to find a reason to give up. So evidently, some glimmer of hope still remains, or he would have just told Igaguri or Isagi to hit him in a tag event and then just let the time run out. But instead he ran away the same everyone else did. Or he could have even just saved himself the hassle of going there and declined the invite. And so Isagi calls him out on that, claiming that he doesn't want to give up. And evidently, he must be at least partly right. He wouldn't even be in this room watching the footage. He wouldn't have noticed Isagi's spatial awareness weapon. He wouldn't be awake at this hour. It seems to me that in Blue Lock, characters are awake at night when they're weighing something up in their minds. Isagi understands the fear of their ending, that standing on that pitch and chasing after that dream means running the risk of losing it. Whereas Chiguri seems to be trying to avoid that sudden loss, to let it gradually slip away whilst he tries not to think about it. Whereas Isagi fights in spite of that fear, and we're going to be talking a lot more about that later on, but for now the two part ways. And so moving forward, Isagi finds himself at the top of the Team Z rankings, meaning that, as things stand, due to him, Kunigami and Gagamaru all having one goal each, Isagi will progress forwards if no one else scores, regardless of Team Z's success. He is, of course, not remotely naive enough to believe that will still be the case 2 matches from now. And so Team Z versus Team W begins, with Team W's attack being spearheaded by the rather goofy Wanama twins, who evidently not only know Chiguri, but actively dislike him as they taunt him over his past injury, claiming that his career is over. Isagi manages to stop them, starting a counterattack that results in Kuon scoring. Kuon then shortly afterwards scores a second, and then finally a hat-trick, putting Team Z 3 goals up and Kuon 2 goals clear as the top scorer at half-time. It all seems to be going a little too well, but in the second half, Kuon loses possession, causing the score to become 3-1. He then sends a pass which is far too short to Isagi, making it 3-2. Kuon begs for forgiveness from his team, but as he stands up, Isagi notices a slimy, snaky smile on his face. So remember how I said people who stay up late in Blue Lock are usually weighing up something in their mind? Now, Kuon said that he hadn't slept for the last 2 nights in a row, ever since they lost that first game, and Team Z realized that one more loss would end their chances of moving through. It finally clicks for Isagi when Kuon intentionally misses a defensive header, causing the score to tie up at 3-3. They finally confront him and everything is revealed. The deal was for Kuon to score 3 goals, then to help Team W win. Now, obviously in reality, this would have to have been done in the opposite order for Team W to have accepted this, as there was no way that it would have trusted Kuon to help them do so, and there's no guarantee that even if he did, they'd manage to get the 4 goals needed. However, if it was the other way around, Kuon helps them win, and then in the last couple of minutes if they're ahead, Team W would have no reason not to let him put a couple goals through. However, obviously that would have completely ruined the suspense and the plot twist, so there we are. But given that it was done in this order, once Kuon had his hat-trick, he then had a choice on who to betray. There was nothing forcing him to help Team W. He could have helped Team Z instead, but he'd already made his decision and wanted to see it through. Although it does seem as though he has a bit of spite towards Team Z, as we'll come back to later in the series. But anyway, with the game now 12 versus 10, or rather 12 versus 9 with Chiguri basically sitting out, Team W easily get their 4th goal to take the lead. Our hero Lemon prevents the score from becoming 5-3, but it still feels as though all hope is completely lost for Team Z. If they are able to grab an equalizer and therefore a draw, they'll still have a chance of progressing through. But that is a huge if. And whilst the rest of his team frantically fights for it, Chiguri just stands there and reflects on what happened before. He used to be the star of his team, brimming with talent and aware of the skill gap between him and everyone else from when he was just 6 years old. And seeing that gap, he believed the world to be split into the talented and talentless. The title of world's greatest striker seemed like a reality to him. His legs felt like a unique gift granted to him and him alone. He was essentially unstoppable. But then a single moment changed it all. An ACL tear, which, if it occurs again, would cause the end of his career. And so he has two choices: to continue playing football and risk that happening, or quit. But Chiguri clearly can't make up his mind because he still lives in this middle ground, still standing on the pitch, but not actually playing. And you can imagine all the thoughts going through his head during his physio training. You know, the frustration, the humiliation, the fear of what's about to happen to both his skill and his leg. But none of that is what really scares him. His greatest fear is losing that hope, the possibility and dream of him becoming the greatest striker. He doesn't want to give up on that, hence he's still playing. But if his leg goes again, he'll have to, hence he doesn't run properly. And it seems bizarre to anyone else looking in from the outside. You know, why is he even here if he's not going to play properly? But he's wanted a reason to give up. He's wanted that decision to be forced onto him so that he'll never have that regret of, what if I kept going? He wants to be eliminated, or does he? It's in those moments where something's about to actually be taken from us that we realize how much we value it, even more so when we see someone else with it. And right now, despite the desperate circumstances, Isagi is still fighting. Despite everything pointing to his career being over, he still has that hope. He even shoves Chiguri to the ground when he realizes that Chiguri still isn't playing. And something about this just cracks Chiguri's resolve to give up and let it all fade away, to give up on the supposed peace of quitting. He finds himself getting frustrated at Isagi's continued fighting, silently begging him to stop, as though it's reawakening a side of him that he's tried to bury down, as though it's proving to him that he can keep playing. And so he asks himself what he's really afraid of: losing his leg, losing his prodigy status. None of that matters nearly as much as the joy he gets from simply playing football. And I find this part really interesting. You know, I don't think he was completely honest with himself until now. I think there is a big part of him that was worried about what other people would think if he did keep playing and injured himself again. But I do still think it's mostly what we said before. You know, deep down he's convinced his career is already over, that if he keeps playing, the injury will happen again and it will inevitably end anyway. But he can't let go of it himself, so he's waiting for someone else to do it for him. But as he watches Isagi, that desire to return to his former joy of playing begins to outweigh his self-pity and his fear of injuring himself again. And so he doesn't care if this is the last time, because that's still one more time than he'd get acting the way he currently is. And so he picks himself up, takes a deep breath, and charges forward, breaking those chains as he does, and resulting in my favorite scene in all of Blue Lock. The greatest striker in the world is me. Isagi immediately realizes just how fast Chiguri is going, and no one is anywhere near him right now. No one else has noticed him because they're all hyper-focused on Isagi, who puts his faith in Chiguri. He pushes himself to go faster, and right before Kuon goes to clear, he catches him. To the absolute awe of Team Z and the horror of Kuon, Chiguri cannot be stopped. Kuon yells at him to slow down, but that voice just fades behind, much like his own. And it all floods back to Chiguri, you know, the joy, the excitement, and in a moment that shows exactly how much he believes in his own speed, he passes to himself and catches up to it. He breaks past everyone and makes a deal with himself that I think he could be happy with either way, that if he misses or breaks his leg again, he'll quit, but if he scores, he'll chase after that title of the world's greatest striker once more. And in a complete switch around of the game so far, everyone else is standing still. Now it's only Chiguri who's moving. And as he equalizes, he slams down on that right leg of his before yelling in celebration with such a pure smile on his face. He's decided to keep playing until his leg falls apart, to keep playing for as long as he can until that inevitable injury. And if that ever does happen in the series, I am not going to be ready for it, bro. I genuinely might cry if that does happen, I can't lie. But anyway, with that win, Team Z now have 4 points, meaning if they win the next game, they hit that magical 7 points, which gives them a chance of getting through. It's still possible for them to qualify if they win their next game. And so moving ahead to the final match of the arc against the unbeaten Team V, who are averaging 6 goals per game, with a single player having 7 goals in just 3 games, Seishiro Nagi. Nagi and Ryo are very different characters to everyone else in the series. For everyone else, this feels like a battle of life and death. The phrase fighting for survival is used a lot, but at first introduction for Ryo it's just a desire, and for Nagi it's even less than that. So their first introduction shows Ryo essentially being perfect at everything, and on top of that he's a multi-billionaire's son. But because everything came so easy to him, he found himself wanting nothing. He was blessed with everything and cursed with wanting none of it. None of it interested him. He wanted a real challenge, and that was when he saw the World Cup, the excitement of the team, and the stadium surrounding it. This was what he wanted. And shortly afterwards he encounters Nagi, who is the complete opposite. He wants nothing, but is seemingly fine with that. He wants no challenge whatsoever. Instead he wants to take it as easy as possible. And yet he has exactly what Ryo wants. Despite having never played the sport before, his control over his phone using his foot is enough proof of his natural skill. But he doesn't want to at all, and it's almost frustrating seeing how lazy this guy seems to be. But it's a point that feels very humiliating for our beloved Team Z. Nagi isn't even trying, and yet he's apparently outperforming all of them at this point in time. But we'll come back to that in a few minutes, as we then come back to Team Z, where Kuon is now announcing that he simply won't play. Being the top goal scorer, he has no incentive to, as he'll pass through regardless, so he'd only risk injury if he did decide to play. To which Kunigami responds with a bold acclamation that he will score a hat-trick against Team V, even though it's 10 vs 11 against the top team. Kunigami wants to be Team V's hero. Quite a lofty ideal, and one which Jinpachi seems to challenge both him and Kuon on. I really like his little speech here, where he talks about ensuring that their successes are reproducible, that they need to reflect on what worked for them, and the conditions that allowed them to succeed. Just hoping it'll all work out simply isn't enough. That'll result in sporadic success at best. Instead, understanding what worked and why down to the most ridiculous level of detail is crucial. And in something like football, that can be quite hard to do with the amount of variables that there are at any one point in time. But as with anything, there's a pattern to it all, and attempting to reproduce those patterns instead of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks is the way to go. But Isagi currently has no idea what that looks like for him, and puts aside his pride to go and ask Barou for genuine advice, something a lot of people wouldn't be willing to do, especially after his bit of trash talk at the end of that match. But whilst he wasn't able to stop Barou in their 1v1 training, he does notice a pattern in his play. He's aiming for the top right corner each time from a relatively similar place on the pitch. He now has his own formula, so Barou is often shown throughout the series to be a step ahead of everyone else when it comes to Ego's advice. Firstly turning the 0 into a 1 naturally, and now having already devised his own formula, which Isagi reverse engineers, which again I think is a great thing to do. He breaks it down bit by bit. Barou can score more often from the zone. Obviously the defenders are going to stop him, So he trains his physique and his speed in order to get past them. It's simple, but it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. So whilst Isagi still isn't able to stop him, this is worlds apart from the first time they played, where he just felt despair both defending against and attacking into Barou. He understands what's going on now, and obviously we see that same pattern against Rin later on, but we'll come back to that, because it's now the last night before the final showdown, with Isagi and Igaguri unable to sleep due to nerves. And although I know a lot of people don't like Igaguri, the contrast between him being so terrified about losing and having to return to this job working at a temple that he hates, that compared to Nagi not caring at all and Ryo doing it out of boredom, only makes this next match all the more interesting. The only person who seems to sleep soundly that night is Bachara, which, again, is actually a really interesting point given his role in the next game. Everyone else is super nervous, and Kunigami is apparently doing one-arm push-ups instead of going to bed. Bro, that's not gonna help. Get some sleep, dude. But anyway, Team Z talk strategy and have a pretty genuine belief they can do this. And as the match begins, their counterattacking strategy has some initial success. Although they don't score, they shut out Team V's attack and get a good one of their own in. But Ryo, with a little bit of foreshadowing at his future abilities, performs the exact same attack with Nagi, who controls a ball in midair, before volleying home the first goal. Team Z tries to keep their spirits up, but Nagi nails home a second goal, and keeping with the theme of using Team Z's weapons but better, Chiguri finds himself being outsped by Zantetsu, who makes it 3-0, not even 20 minutes in, and Team Z just collapses in despair. They don't see a single way to win. In that moment, nobody believed we could keep fighting. Nobody except Bachara. And the funny part about the scene is, at first glance it seems like he's just being his usual, slightly crazy self, but on closer look, what he's saying actually makes a lot of logical sense. Sure, their opponents are great, but it's not like they're doing anything that Team Z can't do themselves. In fact, the goals that they have scored have been using very similar strategies, just better. And so if what they're currently doing isn't working, they just need to try something new. And so they shouldn't be scared. Yeah, it's obviously hard not to be, with the stakes being what they are, but going back to what Isagi said at the very start of the series, if they only stick to what they're capable of, they'll never grow, and they'll eventually hit a wall regardless. And with that, Bachara blitzes past half of Team V, as Isagi realizes what Bachara is saying. They can save their despair for after the match. Wallowing in self-pity right now is just not going to help them. But Bachara's goal certainly is. The score is 3-1 and they're 10 versus 11. But Team Z have grabbed a hold of themselves. They are ready to fight again. And every member of that team embodies the idea of going beyond what you can currently do, starting with Kunigami scoring from outside his usual shooting range to make the score 3-2. But Isagi is still struggling. He can't find a way to make an impact on the game, let alone actually score. And I like how he realizes that he's not going to suddenly unlock one of the talents everyone else has, like their dribbling, for example. Sure, he could work on it and improve it over time, but he's not going to instantly get to that level. And so with the time ticking down, he keeps looking for a way to fight, much to Nagi's interest, who asks Isagi what drives him to push so hard, saying that if he had his level of skill, he would have quit ages ago, which obviously just comes across super rude, but Nagi is just genuinely curious. In particular, he doesn't understand why he didn't just shoot beforehand, as that's not something he would have done. Although Isagi snaps in anger at him, telling him to shut up and that the good part is coming, he does obviously later take these words into consideration. Again, Isagi isn't arrogant enough to believe that he shouldn't or couldn't take advice from those in the position he wants to be. In fact, it is precisely his willingness to do that allows him to become such a monster as the show progresses. But again, we'll obviously come back to that. The point being, the momentary pause he took to control the ball before shooting allowed everyone else to catch up to him for the defense to get into position. It was his delay, his doubt over whether or not to shoot that caused that failure. But again, if he can't have faith in himself, if he can't trust the process even when he's in the middle of it, there really is no point. As Nagi says, it's pointless. We then get another mini speech from Jinpachi, this time talking about awakenings, with Anri describing it as a normal person suddenly becoming a superhero, obviously quite meta, but the point being that it doesn't just happen to someone sitting around. It occurs to those with experience who are actively working towards something and currently pushing their limits to do so. The scattered pieces of success begin to piece together, and something new blooms from it. When facing an impossible opponent, an insurmountable task, the weak will find a new formula to win. And as this happens, Chiguri realizes something, that while Santetsu is faster than him, only in terms of his initial acceleration. When he's at top speed, there's no one who can match him. This is still an entirely new situation for him, one which forces him to figure out a whole new way to use his speed to get around it, forcing a long run between the two, where Chiguri's high top speed will catch up to Zantetsu's initial burst. Team V can't stop him, and Chiguri equalizes. And despite progressing regardless of the result of this game, Team V are pretty depressed about it. But Ryo doesn't see a way past Team Z. They've shut out their system very effectively, despite being a man down, until Nagi, for the first time since coming to Blue Lock, makes a move on his own accord, to the shock of the other 21 players there. Well, 20 if you exclude Kuon, but regardless. He sprints off to receive a pass, and then steamrolls past Team Z, even managing to nutmeg Igaguri, obviously an insane feat of skill against such a formidable player. Nagi previously saw everyone around him as just a pain, but now they're exceeding his expectations. He saw them passionately fighting for survival and wanted to join in on that. His curiosity can't be stopped now that he's seen that rush, felt that desire. He wants a challenge and scores this ridiculous goal to put Team V in the lead once more. Seshiro Nagi's life was filled with boredom until he first felt that curiosity. For Nagi, his awakenings and breakthroughs as a player have less to do with his skill and more his mentality. He simply didn't understand the appeal of football until he really got into it. And this is something I really wish I understood when I was younger. That when you don't feel like doing something, the solution is not to wait around for that to change. It's to start, and then the desire to keep going and challenge yourself follows from that. Obviously for Nagi, it's quite different. You know, for him it was all exceptionally easy and uninteresting, whereas for most of us it's going to be the opposite, and it's very off-putting, it seems far too challenging, but regardless, pushing past that is where the real excitement starts. His life was a total bore until now, because he was never willing to push past the slightest bit of discomfort until now. Anyway, Team Z now needs to score twice in 15 minutes to survive. A draw is not enough, and so even with Igaguri on their team, the situation looks hopeless. But they don't have a choice but to keep going all out until the end. Whilst everyone else around him has been evolving, Isagi has kind of stagnated a bit, until now. Reading the flow of play, he predicts Chiguri's attempt to outspeed Zantetsu, and that Nagi would see it too. This is interestingly pretty much what Rin does to Isagi in the match after this, but we'll come back to that. As Isagi moves a step ahead of Nagi to continue Team Z's attack, and allowing Kunigami to equalize, which also now ties Kuon and Kunigami at 3 goals each. However, Kuon will still progress regardless due to being a higher rank, which has always seemed kind of weird to me that the story treats it as a given that Kuon will still be ranked higher than Kunigami after this game, when surely the rankings would update, and so it's very likely that Kunigami would be higher ranked. I've always found that kind of odd, unless I'm missing something here. But anyway, we get a flashback of Kuon's time with his old team, where he was basically the only one who took it seriously. The only one who was aiming for nationals. His team was eliminated and he vowed to make it no matter what, regardless of what tactics he had to use to do so. However, as we saw, when he first joined Blue Lock, he really did try to work with Team Z. He was the one who rallied them all together, as though they were the teammates he'd always wanted. But it's here that he reflects on it all. With the game as close as it currently is, him joining could potentially give Team Z the win. And we see the shame setting in as he realizes that, yeah, he's gonna advance, but right now, he's that one teammate that's not playing seriously. He basically has what he wanted, a team all fired up, all working towards a singular goal, and now he's the one standing there on the sidelines, not taking it as seriously. And as he reflects on that, Team V begins their attack. However, whilst Isagi is convinced he still has Nagi covered, he uses his back to slip the ball past him, whilst keeping a lot of his momentum. And in a moment, it just all collapses. He's passed every single player on Team Z, leaving him one-on-one against the goalkeeper. Isagi can only watch on in despair as any remaining hope crumbles, until Ruon straight up assaults Nagi, sprinting in from the sideline in order to stop him, getting a very deserved red card in the process, which has a major significance as he's now behind Kunigami in fair play points, meaning Kunigami will be the one to go through, not Kuon. He claims that his body moved on its own, but now that it has, Team Z had better win. But with just 3 minutes of overtime remaining, and Ryo stepping up for a free kick, that's going to be tough to say the least. Lemon finally gets a cool moment, saving Ryo's shot. Zantetsu gets the rebound, but it's blocked by Raichi. Nagi gets that rebound, but it's cleared from the goal line by Gagamaru, and Team Z regain possession for one final chance. With Bachira's dribbling and Chiguri's speed, they're able to blitz up the pitch, and Isagi picks up the ball not too far from the box before passing to Kunigami. As the attack desperately continues, Isagi tries to read ahead, taking account of everyone's weapons and moving to the likely free spot. And it's here that, in the same way Isagi put faith in Chiguri's weapon in the previous game, Bachira crosses to Isagi, believing him capable of finishing the job. But this time it's Nagi who reads Isagi's moves and positions himself to block his shot, leaving Isagi with no clear route to the goal. The current version of Isagi has hit a wall he can't see how to climb, but it's just a mental barrier for him to break. It once again goes back to that old idea in episode 1, that if he keeps doing what he already can, then he'll never improve. And in his desperation to find a way, specifically a way in which he can, he quickly reflects on the 2 moments where he did manage them. His volley at Kira and his volley against Team Y. And that's when everything fits into place. What Nagi said about how he does too much pointless stuff, what Jinpachi said about having a formula, but more than anything, it was all just a mental limit. He doesn't actually need to trap the ball. He can make those kind of shots without doing so. And so he shouldn't allow for that moment for everyone else to catch up to him. And it's a super cool detail how Bachira routinely draws out the best from his teammates, pushing them to do things that they wouldn't have done themselves but ended up being capable of. The first example being Isagi's volley in the tag selection, which Bachira pushes him to go for again here. Then of course later on his passes to Nagi and Ayu again make them go for play that they wouldn't have normally done themselves. It's as though he's also seeing the monster in his teammates, their true potential when they really push themselves. And Isagi realizes that this pass from Bachira is exactly that, him saying, "Shoot, I know you can do it." And so he goes right for it, with a volley that flies right into the top corner, giving Team Z the win. And my favorite part about the scene is his line after it happens, that this is the moment he awakens, that it's his turn to do so, that he won't just watch everyone else get what they want and look on from the sidelines. he's going for it as well. Meanwhile, Nagi looks on in wonder, surprised by the frustration he feels. I mentioned earlier that so far football has kind of been like a video game that he never really cared about in the first place, but he's also playing it on such a low difficulty that it just doesn't engage him at all. But he's now experienced it at an actually challenging difficulty. It was very exciting for him, and he's realized that he likes this game a lot more than he realized. But anyway, the final results were announced with Team V and Team Z clearing through, along with one of the Wanama twins, Nico and Barou, all being the top scorers. Moving ahead to the second selection, I'm gonna skip the first part of it because I don't think there's anything particularly interesting to discuss, but I think it was basically Jinpachi's way of filtering out anyone who just coasted by and managed to get through due to their team winning, whilst not being particularly brilliant themselves. The one thing I do want to talk about, however, is Rin's introduction, where he manages to nail 2 consecutive shots to hit each other. In addition to his demonstration, we also get everyone recognizing his surname as Sai's brother, who, maybe this was just me, but the first time I'd watched this, I completely forgot about him by this point and had to quickly Google it to remind myself who he was. But obviously this really catches our interest and raises 2 major questions. Firstly, just how good is Rin? And secondly, what role is Sai, an outsider to the project, going to play in the future? Obviously, by the end of the season, we have answers to both of these, but at this point in time, I thought it was a great way of expanding the world within the Blue Lock project, as we now have a new player who's set up to be even stronger than Nagi was. I think that was necessary, as although he did still feel like a major threat, he did lose a bit of his spookiness following that defeat. Introducing a big new character like this was definitely a great way of getting us hyped up for the next selection. Team Z's members are now full of confidence following their victory, as they should be. They all overcame a hurdle they thought was previously insurmountable, and so there's no reason they can't do that again, which is an idea that comes up a lot in the second selection, so I'll come back to that. But it's still pretty terrifying for Isagi, as so far his weapon is just his spatial awareness, one which works best in a team, but now he's being forced into a solo test. Now, the actual test itself isn't massively interesting, besides Blue Lock Man being a pretty funny bit of technology. So the balls have these like micro sensors in them, which repels the balls away if they come near the hologram, which is surely a pretty crazy bit of tech, and I'm not sure why it wasn't used in the previous selection. Seems a bit unfair that one guy had to stay in goal the whole time, but I suppose it was just a numbers thing. They didn't want all 11 of them playing outfield, but anyway. The test is essentially Isagi working on improving his ability to quickly read a ball's path and land a good volley at the end of it. Isagi ends up clearing it, and for any Igaguri haters out there, he gets through too, so clearly he's hiding his power level, and it's actually way better than we saw in the first selection. And the second selection starts off very mysteriously. They're told they need to form 3-man teams and they don't know anything else about it. Batra and Isagi naturally pair up and consider either Chiguri or Kunigami for their third, agreeing to go with whoever arrives first. But Nagi extends an offer to Isagi to join as the 3rd member of the Rio Nagi team, which I'm sure he found pretty tempting, but 1, he knows he will work with Batra, and 2, they have been through a lot together, and it'd be pretty rude and awkward if he did say yes. Isagi might be a bit of a madman on the pitch, but he's still very polite off of it, so it's hard to say how much of his decision was down to that, but Nagi evidently does not feel the same awkwardness, immediately declaring that he'll join Isagi's team instead of Rio, stating that although him and Rio declared they wanted to be the best in the world, they lost, so they evidently still have room to grow and learn. So he wants to play with the man who beat them to learn more about the frustration of losing and the joy of winning. I think he's mostly just curious to see if he can experience that excitement again by playing with Isagi. It's not anything personal against Rio, but the two have never lost a game until now, even before Blue Lock. And Nagi never found that particularly interesting. I suppose for him it was the equivalent of replaying a video game on the easiest difficulty, when he was never super into it in the first place. It's become very stagnant for him. But as Nagi later points out to him, I do think Ryo is being quite naive here, believing that the two of them will just inevitably end up being the best in the world and so can continue on regardless. Whereas Nagi recognizes that the heightened stakes of the previous match drew something out of him. He needs new circumstances to continue to grow. Either way, Isagi is very happy to accept this great asset to the team, and the trio walk through the door, leaving Ryo frustrated behind. And the rules for the second selection are super cool. I do love the way Kaneshiro, I hope I pronounced that right, sets up the premise for each of these selections. You can tell he really put thought in how to make each one feel unique and interesting, whilst still fitting in with the vibe of Blue Lock. Starting with 3v3 battles, the winning team steals a player of their choice from the losers, where the two teams proceed to play either 2v2 or 4v4 games depending on the results. Once a team reaches 5 players, they proceed. If one player gets left on their own, they're eliminated. They also have the luxury of choosing their opponents, much to their relief, as currently the only other team there includes Rin. But it once again comes back to that first idea. They could wait for a weaker team to come through and challenge them, but they're here to become the greatest striker in the world. So they're gonna have to beat this guy at some point. Now, yeah, it probably would make more sense to build up to that and go just one level above them to grow gradually that way. And that is effectively what happens in the second selection. But obviously, they don't know the gap between this guy and them. And I really like that they still had the guts to go for it and not back down from the challenge in front of them. Unfortunately, however, as we know, it turns out that Rin is way more than just one level above them. So I'm not going to spend super long on this game, but Rin is set up to be this invincible, godlike player. You know, he even scores from a kickoff. And it's not just him, the other two members of the top 3 are shown to be very potent threats as well. It's immediately made clear that despite Isagi's success against Team V, he still has a long way of being the top of Blue Lock. To Nagi, however, who was looking for this exact challenge, this is what he wanted. He's super hyped up for this, and with their new plan, they're able to get a second goal back. But it's not remotely enough, with Rin scoring a 4th of a corner, and in their final desperate attack, he reads Isagi's every move as though he can read his mind. And to add insult to injury, not only does it feel as though Rin is 2 steps ahead, Isagi realizes that Rin let him think there was an opportunity so he could direct Isagi there. Isagi believed he was the one controlling the field, but it was really just Rin controlling him. The difference in their skill is so great that Isagi can't even fathom the difference. Much like the third time he faced off against Barou, he can't even fully understand why they're losing. And yet, in spite of that, he's utterly captivated by the beauty of Rin's shot, which is actually a really important point I'll come back to. But I think the reason for that is a side of Isagi's mindset that I really like. He doesn't look at people better than him with jealousy, but instead with admiration, and tries to figure out what they're doing that he can use himself. And the way he starts doing that from the next match onwards is precisely what makes him into the monster he is by the end of the season. But that's a way off. And speaking of monsters, Batra is chosen to join the winners, leaving Isagi with a warning that he's not going to wait for him. If he wants him, he needs to steal him back. The pair are left to reflect on their loss, with Nagi being pretty composed, whilst Isagi wallows in frustration. And this seems to be a bit of a trend for him at this point. He needs someone to snap him out of it when he gets into this state, with Nagi once again doing exactly that. Then Barou walks through the door, obviously raising a major question. We already saw that his team lost every single one apart from the one against Team Z, so it's not completely crazy that he lost. But who on earth was on his team that got picked ahead of him? Turns out it was the Aomori's messy guy hyped up in episode 1. At the time of writing, at chapter 279, actually 280, we've still yet to see him do anything due to being injured in this selection here. So I don't know if we're ever going to see him at this point, honestly, but Anyway, Isagi's gut instinct is once again telling him to fight Barou. However, that same gut instinct just lost him the previous game. And again, I don't think Barou is the best target for him. Maybe start with someone a little closer to you. And his teammate is actually exactly that, Naruhaya. So whilst the two teams kinda challenge each other, they don't agree to a match just yet. Isagi still has his doubts as he talks to Nagi about how both their weapons kind of require a pass from someone else to be of any use, which ironically makes Barou the absolute worst possible teammate. But anyway, Naruhaya later comes up to see Isagi and addresses the elephant in the room, that neither of them are getting picked if their team loses. Nagi and Barou are just outright better players, and as such it's do or die for them. They don't have the luxury of hoping they'll get picked if they lose. And with that now being put out into the open, Isagi feels like he can't back down from the challenge now, and accepts, resulting in the match that would essentially make Isagi who he is today. It starts pretty much exactly how you'd expect, with Barou scoring from 29 meters out, followed by Isagi having the awful realization that he can't even get past Naruhaya 1v1. In a 2v2 match, he's pretty useless. He doesn't have the passing technique to give Nagi a crazy pass. He doesn't have the dribbling to get past anyone. He doesn't really have anything. Meanwhile, Nagi is able to quickly figure out a way to defeat even Barou 1v1, even without any crazy passes, simply using his momentum against him and using his crazy control to slip past him. He's really starting to embody a lot of Ego's teachings, using a formula to turn a range of circumstances into an opportunity on goal with his technique. In fact, Nagi has two formulas, one that starts with him resetting the ball, and another that breathes life into it, enabling him to score a second goal. Following kickoff, Barou immediately shoots, and as soon as Naruhaya gets the rebound, he immediately passes to Barou to equalize, and the pattern is pretty clear. By this point, this match is basically a 1v1 between Barou and Nagi, with Isagi and Naruhaya just kind of being there, supporting them. It's kind of humiliating for Isagi, who just a couple days ago felt as though he was on the level of everyone else, that it was his turn to awaken against Team V. However, despite that victory, he's now unable to make a mark. And to add to that humiliation, Naruhaya, who is honestly a bit of a nobody, says that the simple reason he challenged Isagi was that he genuinely thought he could win. He's watched him play and seen his weaknesses 1v1. And to be called out on something you're actively stressing over has got to be one of the most heart-stopping things imaginable. I would honestly be bricking it if I was Isagi right now, but he manages to stay relatively level-headed. But it's at this moment that Naruhaya is able to get behind him, leaving him clear on goal. But he lacks the shooting power of someone like Barou. His shot is saved, but Barou grabs the rebound to make it 3-2. And this is where Isagi realizes that him and Naruhaya are opposites, both lacking the other's strength. Isagi can score if he gets into position, but lacks the ability to do so. Naruhaya can get into a good position, but struggles to do anything with it. If one of them was able to unlock the other, they'd be able to nearly match the level of the geniuses on the pitch, completely transforming the match. But despite Isagi's best efforts, he just can't get past Naruhaya. None of his little tricks he's trying are working, and he finds himself reliant on Nagi to get the equalizer. Barou makes it 4-3, and Isagi still has nothing. But then he starts reflecting on what happened. Despite the stakes and the situation they found themselves in, he stays level-headed and looks at what went wrong, what he could have done differently, separating it into things that he could control and couldn't control. And I really respect that he doesn't just chalk it up to luck or give into despair or anything like that. It's just, what can I do next time? As that's the only question that's going to be productive here. And because of that, it finally clicks for him. Naruhaya has been in his blind spot this whole time. It opens up his mind to a whole new area of football. Up until now, he'd only been looking at 1v1s in the time someone has the ball, and not even considering the movement off the ball. he has to completely break down his current understanding of the game, his current common sense, completely discarding what he thinks he can and can't do. He's got to be willing to accept that there are some things he's simply not doing. But whilst that's something a lot of people are generally pretty reluctant to accept, instead of opting to blame anything or anyone else, for Isagi it doesn't even really feel like he's accepting anything. He just recognizes what he's lacking and acts on it. And, the more I look into Blue Lock and Isagi's mindset, the more I find myself really respecting it and wanting to embody it myself. It really is about far more than just ego. Nagi equalizes at 4-all, and its next goal wins. Isagi is deep in thought. He knows what he needs to work on, he just has to figure out how to go about doing so, and in particular, how he can instantly change in order to do so. Because it's not like he's going to have time to improve his sprinting or his dribbling or anything like that. And in fact, when the match kicks off again, he almost doesn't get a chance to do anything at all, as Barou nearly scores straight from a kickoff. Naruhaya grabs the rebound, but his shot misses. Unsurprisingly, he's not going to be able to just upgrade his shooting by just wishing for it. But what Isagi's trying to do is something that can be picked up fairly quickly. Even if not perfectly, he can certainly have a good go at it. He figured out what Naruhaya was doing, using what Rin said to him earlier as a bit of a hint. Again, he takes in everything he possibly can. Naruhaya was waiting for the inevitable moment the defender has to take their eyes off him to look at the ball, and then using that chance to slip behind Barou. And I love the scene so much, from Isagi's willingness to observe and incorporate strategies of those around him, to the fact that he's just gotten past an opponent he saw as utterly unbeatable the first time he saw them. Everything's come together for him in a beautiful way, with each piece he's picked up building on the previous one. Nagi's pass comes through, and Isagi gets the game-winning goal. Naruhaya is filled with frustration, blaming himself for not being able to make that game-winning goal, not being able to copy Isagi's weapon. But I think his frustration is kind of misplaced here. Honestly, there was no way he was going to be able to suddenly pick something like that up. But anyway, Isagi picks Barou, and Naruhaya's journey ends. So there's a few bits in between this and the next match, but none of it particularly noteworthy, perhaps besides the conversation Isagi has with Barou, which basically just shows how stubborn this guy is. In spite of losing his last 5 games in a row, he's still insistent that he's the king and refuses to adapt his playstyle. He's obviously the polar opposite of Isagi, blaming everything except himself and making 0 adaptations in spite of losing so many matches. And it's pretty baffling to see, but I think it's mostly the product of being a big fish in a small pond for so long. That playstyle has gotten him incredibly far. He's even still a major threat at this level with it, but it's inevitably going to hit a wall, as we'll see. The next match being against Kunigami, Chiguri, and Ryo. And it's interesting to see how the writer chose to return to 3 familiar characters after the first match was against 3 brand new ones. But I think it makes a lot of sense, as regardless of the result, 2 characters that we have a bit of a connection to are going to be left behind. It also means that everyone is already pretty aware of everyone else's playstyle and their strengths, which results in some interesting strategies from the start, like Kunigami being able to shield Barou from entering his shooting zone. But Ryo is kind of just weird in this match, to be honest. He really has it in for Isagi for stealing Nagi, which it wasn't even his decision. What is it he's done wrong here? But anyway, with Barou refusing to pass, Ryo and Kunigami are able to steal the ball off him. Remember what I said about how Isagi and Nagi wanted a great passer on their team, because that would fit their weapons well? Yeah, they really shouldn't have challenged Barou's team. He's the worst possible match for them. The ball ends up with Chiguri, and Nagi has no chance at catching him. It's an easy 1-0 for them. Their team is simply far more balanced than Isagi's, although the bigger problem is undoubtedly Barou's complete refusal to pass. even when Isagi puts himself in a brilliant position. It might have worked up to this point for them, but now Ryo and Kunigami have got him fully figured out. And as Kunigami makes it 2-0, it looks as though Barou's in course to lose his 6th consecutive game. And as we get into the third kickoff, Isagi realizes something that would have been utterly inconceivable until now. When he thinks about Barou scoring, all he sees is a dead root with no chance of success. The mighty Barou is now completely useless, but Nagi lights up the pitch with roots to the goal, and with a single pass to him, they're able to claw one back. But obviously they don't want to play 2 versus 3, and so Isagi tries to convince Barou to actually play with them. But as I mentioned earlier, the two have complete opposite mindsets. One will adapt in whatever way possible in order to win, and the other will refuse adapting, even if it means defeat. And so it's no surprise that Barou has no interest in what Isagi's saying. And I think Barou's mindset kinda sucks. I'm gonna be honest, I love him as a character, I think he's super interesting, and obviously the scene we're going to come to is super inspiring. That's one of my most kind of liked video, I suppose, is that one I did on Barou, and we're going to come back to that. But what he says here to me just shows a lot of bad thought patterns. He says firstly that what pisses him off the most is that he has all this skill and yet can't seem to win. And firstly, it's pretty obvious what the problem here is. Pass to your team, bro. Secondly, there's a quote from Haikyuu that I love. It plays in my head all the time. He who would climb the ladder must begin at the bottom. The ladder doesn't care how frustrated you are, how hard you've worked, or how desperately you want to win. The ladder is simply a ladder. No amount of hard work or talent guarantees anything, unfortunately. The world is simply that big and scary of a place that no matter what level you reach, there's always going to be someone there to match you, especially in something like a sport. Unless you're the best in the world, and obviously even then, number 2 is going to be right on your heels. But the point being, Barou is just kind of internally demanding that he wins and getting frustrated when it isn't working. We've seen him blame his team over and over again, and up until now, he's always been the best player on his team. With the possible exception of the Aoyama's Messi guy, as he did get chosen ahead of Barou, but we don't know anything about him, so it's hard to say for sure. You know, they might have just thought that he matched their team better. But anyway, for the first time in this match, he's going to be forced to watch his teammates outshine him. He's going to lose his usual excuse for why he loses. And as Nagi points out, if he doesn't accept defeat, he won't feel true frustration and he won't be able to move on. Despite his failures, he still sees himself as the king. He's unwilling to accept that there's players out there better than him, and until he does so, he's only going to continue to be overtaken by them. And precisely that happens, with Kunigami scoring again to make it 3-1. Him and Chiguri are 2 players that he saw as nothing before. They were powerless to stop him last time, but now the tables have turned. Everyone around him is simply progressing far faster than he has, and Isagi has finally reached his breaking point with Barou's just utter refusal to cooperate. He completely gives up on that idea and instead looks to devour him, and he does so in spectacular fashion. I gotta admit, I'm liking Isagi a lot more on this reread, but anyway. He runs towards Barou as though he's going to pass, causing their defense to shift towards him, before crossing over to Nagi, again causing their defense to shift towards blocking the pass. But with Isagi so close to Barou, no one had thought to mark him too. Their focus was entirely on the other 2, allowing him to slip for a blind spot past their defense. The prideful king was used as nothing but bait for one he looked down on with almost disgust not long ago. And I love this line from Isagi. It's a bit cheesy, but it's still a good one. You can't change other people, so your only choice is to change yourself. That's the only way to change a world which doesn't go your way. Isagi blasts it past Blue Lockman, and the score is 3-2. Barou is horrified. He's never had a teammate use him like that before, and to top it all off, Isagi, I'm not sure if he's riding some sort of high after that goal or what, but turns to Barou in one of the coldest moments in the series and tells him, "Don't get in our way, loser." Or donkey, or there's a few translations, one of which would probably demonetize me, but you get the idea. But again, Barou's thought process is just, I'm just gonna prove you wrong. I'm gonna show that I'm the king of the pitch, and not how he's going to do that. And I see a lot of myself in this, honestly, and the frustration of your hard work not paying off. But it's not like he's the only one who worked hard to get there. Obviously, Nagi and Rio are exceptions, but everyone else has also had to work hard. But if Barou changed his approach, I really don't think they'd be able to stop him if he was actually willing to pass to his team. But he still carries on in the exact same way. And to add extra humiliation to it all, not only does he lose the ball again, but Isagi predicted that he would and was positioned perfectly to receive it, who then passes to Nagi to grab the equalizer. Igaguri, however, refuses to sit back and be defeated, changing his dribbling style to reduce how much speed he loses on each touch, enabling him to put them back at 4-3. And here we get a real deep look at what's going on in Barou's head, as he lies on the ground, frustrated and angry, baffled by what's happening. Barou reflects on his past growing up, where he was so talented, so overwhelmingly good, that he saw everyone else as simply supporting actors and believed that they should just work to support his goals. And his teammates were quite happy to, as it meant they would win. But that kind of thinking was just baffling to Barou. He didn't understand the fun in it. They might have been happy just winning, but although he's shown to be frustrated when he loses, he seems to embody the quotes Jinpachi gave in episode 1, talking about how a lot of the top players prefer to score themselves and lose than not score and win. The reason Barou plays football isn't actually to win, it's for the rush he gets when he drags others off the stage, others who have worked just as hard and take it just as seriously as he does. But with what we've seen of him, I struggle to imagine that your average high school player really did work just as hard as him, or take it just as seriously as him. But now, he's in a world where everyone does. Everyone here is an exceptionally good player who works extremely hard, as opposed to his previous teammates who might have just played once or twice a week. And now he's being the one forced off the stage. The king is forced to kneel and cower before the commoners. And in desperation to stop that happening, on the next kickoff he immediately shoots. But it's just about saved. I think that's the third time he's tried to score from a kickoff and it's not worked. But anyway, Kunigami picks up the rebound, but his pass to Rio is intercepted by Isagi. However, when Rio tackles him, the ball ends up in front of Barou's path, but just outside of his shooting range. He desperately charges towards it, but Igaguri catches up to him, leaving him to desperately try to figure out a plan. But the only option he really has is to try and shoot from outside his usual range. But he doesn't, because in front of him is Isagi, who non-verbally demands a pass with his positioning. Barou himself doesn't understand why he does so, but he instinctively passes to Isagi, and he can only watch on in horror as he nails home the equalizer. And this is when Barou finally accepts it. He is not the lead actor right now. He's nothing but a supporting actor. Just like Nagi said he would need to, he accepts the defeat he feels, the despair that fills him, that he's been pushed into a role that he pushed over to others for so long. Football doesn't exist just for him, he's not a king. And the part about, football doesn't exist just for me, we've kind of spoken about it already, where, he's not the only one working hard here, but I think this is a moment of realization for him. It's the first time he's fully accepted that, and that there are players just as good or even better than he is. And he doesn't seem to know how to handle that. It goes against everything he's believed up until now. It goes against pretty much every single match he's played up until now, especially the ones before he came to Blue Lock. And it's interesting because remember how I spoke about how Barou kind of embodies a lot of Jinpachi's ideals? And interestingly, what he's going through right now is quite similar to the reason Blue Lock was created in the first place, albeit on a smaller scale. So obviously Blue Lock was created for these Japanese players to become the best in the world rather than just the best in their country. Barou is currently seeing how small his own football bubble may have been up until now. Obviously, he'll have seen skilled players before, but I doubt he's ever been surrounded by so many on the same level as him. And I imagine Jinpachi was eagerly watching to see how he'd respond to it. And so, with the score at 4-4, its next goal wins. The team planned their strategies, with both sides recognizing that Chiguri is the biggest threat right now, due to his speed being very difficult to handle in a small game like this. And so, following kickoff, Isagi blocks the path to Chiguri, kind of daring Ryo to pass to Kunigami. And I love how, throughout this scene and a lot of the ones preceding it, rather than seeing Isagi's thoughts on everyone else, we're mostly seeing everyone else's thoughts on Isagi. This, combined with the way he's acting, kind of makes him feel like the villain that everyone else is trying to beat right now. And Ryo aims to do exactly that. He doesn't need to fully get past Isagi, he just needs an opening to pass to Chiguri, as Nagi won't be able to catch him once he does so. He breaks open enough of a gap, but whilst Chiguri dashes ahead, Nagi, the instant Ryo goes to pass, dashes away from him, rushing perpendicular to the ball to try and intercept it first. And the ball, as though the sport itself was testing Barou, lands at his feet, resulting in one of my favourite scenes in the entire series, and one that has made me root for Barou ever since. Isagi and Nagi charge up the pitch, with Ryo and Chiguri close behind, leaving Barou to reflect on his current state, and that he weirdly doesn't feel frustrated. It doesn't particularly bother him that he's falling behind. He's almost kind of given up. He's quite content being in this supporting role. He's content on giving up on scoring himself, as doing so will salvage him from this sense of defeat. It'll let him get over the discomfort he feels right now. And not only that, he can justify it to himself quite nicely, that he's creating a chemical reaction, that it's a supporting actor's reason for being. But when he goes to pass, an awful, sickening feeling takes hold in a moment of realization. It's a moment I've had at a few points in my life, and honestly I wish it happened earlier and way more often, but the realization that what he's about to do right now is a crossroads. You know, it's just one pass, but what follows that? Now, I'm not a hustle culture, work 24/7 kind of guy, you know. I've spoken a lot about prioritizing health first and making sure you find time for the things really important to you, but I also do believe in working hard, right? But like everyone else, I've had days where I've gone, oh, I'm too tired or whatever reason, so I'm not going to do that today. And if that truly is just a sporadic thing, then so be it. But sometimes you have to ask yourself, what future follows this? Am I going to pass on doing that thing I said I would every time I feel this tired or every time I don't feel up to it? Because it's so easy to convince yourself it's just a one-time thing. And before you know it, it becomes a habit and it happens way more often than you realize. Obviously, I'm speaking from experience here. And so for some people, they slip into that temporary comfort, into whatever justification they have for not doing something, and they stay there. They never actually come out of that. And Barou instinctively realizes, from seeing everyone else around him do exactly that, his old teammates, his Team X teammates, that if he chooses the comforting path this time, when is he ever going to return to how he was? And if he doesn't stand up to that, he can see the future it will lead him down. There's a really harrowing shot, which has stuck in my mind a lot, of him alone in this dark room, miserable, sipping on a beer, watching Isagi live the life he wants. Passing now would save him from this sense of defeat. He'd win this match. But we're once again at that same idea from episode 1. Just coasting by and winning a game like that isn't going to get him to where he wants. None of his old teammates were invited to Blue Lock. Presumably anyway, no one seems to recognize him, but no one else on Team X survived the first selection, we know that for sure. And if he acts the way they did, he won't survive this either. To sit by and justify why he couldn't do it, to be filled with regret his whole life, he refuses to live that way. His desperation explodes as he storms past Kunigami. He feints his way past Ryo, using the same strategy Isagi did when he first started to devour Barou, using him as a decoy, as a blind spot to slip past everyone on the field and charge on ahead, launching a black flash, a shot, which curves into the top right corner to win the match and restoring his identity as king. He's still capable of playing the way he used to, he's still a threat at this level. He's had to accept certain things like defeats that we'll come back to, but he proved to himself that he doesn't need to cower from anyone else here. He just needs to accept that he can't just steamroll through every single time without thinking the way he used to. And so the next question is, who do they select from their opponents? Ryo or Kunigami is the most logical answer. Again, Isagi and Nagi's weapons can best shine with a solid passer, and having a defensive player would balance them out a lot more. But in spite of picking the worst possible match for that role in Barou, they still won. And not just that, Isagi in particular was an absolute monster in this match. He evolved so much from the last game where he was practically useless until the end. This time around, he was the most dangerous player on the pitch. That kind of evolution happened because of Barou, because they all had to figure out something new and they all kept trying to outdo each other. And there's only one man who fits that job description, Igaguri, who looks kind of horrified by it, stating to Kunigami that he'll be feeling just as frustrated as he is due to losing his opportunity to beat Isagi. But it's the conversation between Ryo and Nagi that I find particularly interesting, with Nagi going over to him to effectively say, well played, it was a close game that could have gone either way, and you're evidently a very skilled player, we're going ahead, but I'm sure I'll see you soon. And I don't think he's saying this just because he feels like he needs to, but instead because he genuinely means it. It was a very close game. If, that rebound off Nagi's foot had gone differently, they could have lost, and so many other tiny little things could have happened which would have changed the game. So I think he genuinely does mean it, but Ryo is not happy, telling him, just admit you don't give a damn about me anymore, claiming that Nagi has changed and that he's forgotten their promise to become the best in the world together. I quite strongly disagree with what he says. Nagi has changed, yes, but he's not forgotten about their promise whatsoever. The whole reason he went to play with Isagi in the first place was to learn more about the frustration he felt and develop as a player. It was nothing against Ryo. He just recognized that he'd be limited if he stayed with him the entire time. And as he points out, would Ryo really be satisfied if you picked him? Would he actually? Or is he just kind of taking his frustrations out, being kind of childish and naive? As Isagi points out, becoming the best in the world is not that simple. He recognizes that. He's seen players like Rin up close. They lost a 11 vs 10 match to Team Z. He realizes that it's much harder than they first thought, whereas Ryo has had everything easy his whole life. The idea of having to actually struggle for something is fairly alien to him. Again, he's a billionaire's son, right? So let's be real, he's not had anywhere near as much hardship as most people. So he has this naive belief that if Nagi picks him here, all will be well. But in reality, that would just completely stagnate Ryo's growth. They'd go back to being the pair that they were when they lost to Team Z. And Ryo's honestly kind of pathetic display here is extremely irritating to Nagi, who's seen the benefits of this, of pushing beyond their comfort zone, of fighting to survive, things Ryo isn't willing to do. And so he turns around and leaves Ryo behind, stating, "You're a pain, I don't care anymore." And I also love the line from Isagi afterwards. "Don't be the one who gets chosen, be the one who gets chooses. What are you even doing here?"
Ryo clearly has the potential to go extremely far in Blue Lock. In fact, realistically, given that he's reached the level he has in just 6 months, he should be a real contender for it. But unlike Nagi or Barou, he's not accepting defeat, he's not feeling that frustration and looking into it. Instead, he's just kind of blaming Nagi for it, deflecting it away from him. And even Kunigami seems to recognize this, grabbing him to lift his head up and making him watch them walk away. If he can't even look at the victors as they walk off, what chance does he have of ever being one himself one day? The pair are left behind, but it's not the last of them that we'll see. But we'll come back to that. As the winning four move through to the next round, we then get a bit of a flashback from Bachara, showing his passion for the sport as a young child, and in particular his pure joy in dribbling, that there's nothing more fun in the world. But his friends, in quotation marks for obvious reasons, never saw it that way. To them it was boring because Bachara was so much better at it than them. And so, following his well-intended yet truthfully quite unhelpful advice that they need to become one with the ball, whatever that means, they turn on him, calling him weird and claiming that all he thinks about is football, which is clearly just outside of jealousy, but is obviously still pretty upsetting for Bachara, who throws himself into a fight against them. He talks to his mum about it afterwards, about how he just wants them to play with him, how he loves football more than anything else in the world, it really excites him, etc. And his mum describes that feeling as something beautiful, and something that needs to be protected. As what happens to many people is they pretend they don't hear it until they eventually forget. They pretend they don't care about something that they really do, be it through fear of mockery, failure, whatever it may be. And to me, it seems like the voice of the monster in your heart that she talks about is that kind of overwhelming desire to throw yourself into something, to pull towards something that you can't stop thinking about. And I imagine she's gone through a similar struggle at some point to Bachara, being pushed away from painting for whatever reason. But Bachara, being a child, obviously doesn't really understand what she's trying to say. So he takes it very literally. He imagines that monster, someone who has just as much passion for the sport as he does. Because growing up, there wasn't anyone else like that around him. He'd visualized the way someone like that would play, and none of his teammates would match up to her. But the professionals he saw on TV did, and so he hoped that one day he'd be surrounded by players like that. But as everyone around him tells him off for the way he plays, he becomes dispirited. He still tries to believe in that pure joy for the sport, but sometimes wonders if he will ever share a team with those who share the same joy. And the overwhelming fear of that never happening, of spending a lifetime in isolation, unable to share that passion with anyone else and losing that excitement he once had, unsurprisingly got him pretty down at times, until he got an invite to Blue Lock. And his earlier actions in episode 1 start to make a bit more sense. The way he was just having a laugh and enjoying himself in the middle of such an intense situation. He'd been looking for that exact intensity. And Isagi in particular played exactly the same way he envisioned the monster playing. And that, combined with his overwhelming fear of loneliness, his desperation not to be alone anymore, caused him to take that gamble in stealing the ball off Isagi, before passing it right back to him, knowing that he'd hit Kira. The gut instinct of everything he'd seen told him to believe in Isagi. And so, jumping back to present day, he now sees that same monster in Rin, in a different way to Isagi, but regardless, as he walks out of the training room after practicing with him, he sees the excitement in their challenge. He wants to know which of the two are the more fun monster. The rematch against Rin is confirmed, and jumping straight into kickoff, it's immediately apparent to Bachara that Isagi has gotten a lot better, able to immediately read the field and defend against Bachara's moves much more effectively than last time. With Barou joining in the tackle, Bachara is forced to pass and is intercepted by Isagi, who then passes to Nagi. But Rin has positioned himself perfectly to stop him. Not too close that he can pop the ball over him, but not too far that he can't reach Nagi if he chooses to stop the ball there. We're once again reminded that Rin is just on another level entirely to anyone else. And at this point, it's clear that he's basically an upgraded version of Isagi, one without any of his weaknesses. However, there's one thing he can't match, and that's Chigury's speed. So as Nagi passes to him,
he can slip past him to get to the goal to make it 1-0, much to Bachira's excitement. The game resumes, and after a bit of back and forth, it falls to Rin, and we get this kind of boss fight music. Nagi rushes towards him, but Rin was just baiting him in, pretending to shoot before slipping past him. But this gives Igaguri and Isagi enough time to catch up to him, but he fakes the pair of them out again. He's not giving them time to think. It's as though he's mentally steps ahead of everyone, knowing what's going to happen in advance. Obviously, this is very similar to Isagi, something that will be significant later on in this match. But the major difference is that Rin can create infinite possibilities with his own skill. Unlike Isagi, he can get past players by himself or score from a distance, which makes him basically impossible to deal with. He shoots and scores to make it 1-0, but although they couldn't stop him, it's a completely different game to last time. He can understand Rin's movements and his thought patterns, whereas before the gap was so wide that Isagi couldn't even understand why they lost, or how much better Rin was. Remember the first time he faced off against Barou? He couldn't understand why he lost to him either? Well, we saw how that last game went. He climbed that wall, and so what's to stop him from doing it again? We kick off once more, and this time Isagi tries to position himself for Igaguri to pass to him, but Rin gets there first once again. And he now realizes that the two of them are likely seeing the field the same way. The difference is that Rin is simply faster and stronger. Bachira sends a high pass to Ryu, who scores a header to make it 2-1, when Nagi realizes the same thing as Isagi. Because Rin matches Isagi's vision of the field, in order to beat Rin, they have to do something completely unexpected to him, something that he can't calculate, starting with a dash to a completely different direction than Nagi originally planned. By not really thinking about what he's doing, it's likely to be something that Rin hasn't predicted and instead has to respond to. And Rin is still just about able to do so. Obviously, he positions himself in such a way that he's able to respond to most plays. But one thing he never could have anticipated was Nagi's two-stage volley, which completely slips past Rin, equalizing things up at 2-2. And for the first time, having spent the entire time up until now talking about how boring everyone else there is, Rin admits that he's fired up. Nagi's play was beyond his usual expectations. He's actually starting to be challenged. We kick off again, and despite their best attempts to stop Rin, he's able to thread a pass through to Bachira, who makes it 3-2. Isagi's team reflects on how their ordinary by-the-book plays aren't going to work against Rin. They have to go beyond what he can visualize, and if they can do so, it is perfectly possible for them to score. And as you might be thinking, this is a 4v4 game, but I've only mentioned 3 players on Isagi's team so far, and that is because Barou has been quietly sitting back and observing, and his entire playstyle is the unpredictable. So when we kick off again and they all charge forward, Igaguri slips past Ryu using his speed, then passes across to Nagi, whilst Isagi gets behind Bachira using the tricky launch from Naruhaya. And for a moment it looks as though he's through on goal, but Rin saw through all of that. He's ready and waiting for him, and Isagi just can't get past him. It looks completely doomed until, in one of the funniest scenes in the series, Barou shows up and steals the ball off Isagi, to the shock of everyone there on the pitch. But with that, he's passed everyone. The idea of stealing the ball from your teammate is particularly alien to Rin. Something as ridiculous and chaotic as that would never even occur to him. And with that, we're level again at 3-0. However, now Rin is aware that Barou would try something like that, and so it's going to be much harder to pull that off again. Bachira's solo run is stopped by Isagi and Barou, who begins to steamroll up the pitch until he's stopped by Rin, who moves back up the pitch with Tokimitsu and ends up getting a free kick, which ends up scoring to put him 1 goal away from victory again. The next kickoff begins, and Isagi is fully aware that Rin is observing everything going on. He passes wide to Igaguri, where he can get to it first, and everyone charges forward in response. So Isagi, believing that Rin won't spot him, dashes diagonally to be the closest to Chigiri, breaking free from the group and putting him in front of goal unmarked. But Rin was never too far away, catching up to Isagi and positioning himself to block him. Isagi seems to admit defeat, that this guy is just too good for him to beat, but that is exactly what Isagi wanted Rin to think he was thinking. If him and Rin are seeing the same vision, Isagi just needs to come up with the next move and ensure that it's one Rin wouldn't expect, just like Nagi and Barou did. With Isagi's specialty being his direct shot, it's natural for Rin to assume that he'd go right for it and extend his leg to block him in doing so. But because he does that, the space behind him opens up, allowing Isagi to backheel the ball in to equalise. And in what seems to be a bit of a pattern with the player who's not had much impact all game suddenly reflecting on everything before the last goal, Bachira is now reflecting on it all. He feels as though he's been left behind this game. Rin and Isagi are exactly what he was looking for when he came to Blue Lock. But just wanting to play football with those two isn't a reason that's going to push him to reach their level. When a character has a goal of just achieving this, when they hit it, they really stagnate afterwards. Not only that, as pointed by Nagi shortly after the next kickoff, it looks as though Bachira assumes that if he loses, he's going to be picked. It seems to really shock him when Nagi points out that that's not going to happen. Rin is clearly the better option, and this sends Bachira into an absolute frenzy. But despite that, everyone else sprints on ahead of him, and he finds himself lagging behind. Bachira's development is really different to everyone else in the series. It's not really about how he plays football, but more why and his mindset as a person. And the thing is, he talks about how just playing football with Isagi would have been enough for him, but that would eventually hit an end in Blue Lock, as after all, there can only be one winner. But football for Bachira seems to be a bit less about winning and more about the enjoyment he gets from it. Obviously he still wants to win, but it's a bit less important to him than it is to everyone else in Blue Lock. He's more desperate not to go back to that loneliness. He doesn't want to be on his own.
And I really like what his mum says. I feel like it applies to a lot more than just Bachira's situation. That when people become adults, they still want to believe, but forget how. They pretend they can't hear their own voice until eventually they really can't. Now, to me, for Bachira's situation, this is essentially about how he's spent this whole time trying to find a friend to play football with. And now that he's found the monsters he was looking for, he's more focused on making sure he doesn't lose them than he is simply enjoying the sport. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but he makes a sudden charge at Isagi, who has to pass over to Chigiri, and as everyone charges forward, he then crosses over to Nagi, who controls the ball and passes it back to Isagi, who is in a pretty good position for a shot. Bachira desperately tries to catch up to him, but can't reach him in time. He takes a shot that looks like it's going in, but Rin was there to block it. And just like Barou in the previous game, the ball falls to Bachira, who starts to work his way up the field, silently begging the monster not to come out. He wants to fight on his own this time. He doesn't want to be reliant on other people. He doesn't want to keep looking for the presence and validation of those around him. He knows that'll only hold him back. But it's not an easy habit to break. He's become so used to looking for it, as it was after all what got him through his loneliness when he was younger, but it's now reached a point where he feels like he can't play without those who saved him from that loneliness. He's become quite dependent on them, but he realizes that this isn't going to allow him to move forward. It's now more of a curse, and so he goes on a solo rampage, blitzing past Isagi, who immediately realizes that something's changed in Bachira, as he ignores Ryu and instead nutmegs Chigiri, then slips past Barou to charge through on goal. And unsurprisingly, it's Barou who first recognizes that he's not going to pass, but him and Chigiri and Nagi all surround him, but Rin, as always, positions himself perfectly. A pass from Bachira there is almost certainly a goal, even with Isagi trying to chase him down. But Bachira tries to get past all three of them, and in quite uncharacteristic fashion for him, internally insults all of them. And I think this is where it clicks for him that this is supposed to be the game he loves. He shouldn't be getting angry and insulting people, or standing around in sort of misery. It's been so long since he played without thinking or needing anyone else, and yet he was perfectly happy back then, just practicing these crazy freestyling moves. He had so much fun by himself, and I think this is something we all do. You know, we don't want to go back to something or start something new without someone else with us. But when you just go for it by yourself, you'll inevitably find his people anyway. And as Bachira accepts the potential loneliness that even in the worst case scenario he'll still keep moving forward, he fires off a shot towards goal. But Isagi is there to block it. So going back 8 seconds in the match, Isagi recognised that as soon as Bachira decided not to pass to Rin, he clearly wasn't going to pass at all. You know, he would have already done so if he was going to. And so instead, believing that Bachira could get past all three of them, he took a gamble. He put his faith in Bachira to break free, and moved to block his shot when he goes to do so. And above all, this isn't something Rin would have even considered. He doesn't know Bachira anywhere near as well as Isagi, and so he couldn't have recognized that he was going on a solo rampage anywhere near as quickly as Isagi did. And even then, he probably wouldn't have expected him to get past 3 players on his own once more. And so Isagi had moved a step ahead of Rin. However, the random deflection is not something anyone could predict or anticipate. It's near enough random, right? And so to Isagi's absolute horror, it lands at Rin's feet, who controls the ball before ending the game 5-4. Isagi was defeated once again and collapses in frustration. In spite of his best efforts, Rin seems to just be this one step ahead of him all the time. Meanwhile, Bachira feels much more content. He doesn't feel as though he's dependent on Isagi anymore. And he begins to say which player he wants to steal before Rin interrupts him. But I think he was genuinely going to pick Isagi. You know, he now feels as though he can pick Isagi rather than needing to. I think that's what he was going to do here. But anyway, Rin interrupts, demanding that the decision be his. And it's kind of impossible to argue against the guy who's carried the team, so it ends up being his decision. But basically he admits that he felt defeated by Isagi at the end there. He couldn't read that play at all. So even though he won, that last play left a horrid taste in his mouth. And I'm not sure why he doesn't think the same about Nagi's 2-stage volley or Barou stealing the ball. I suppose this is because it was Isagi and Rin both looking at someone else rather than an opponent suddenly surprising him with a secret weapon or tactic, but anyway. He chooses Isagi to join his team, eliminating any risk of him losing before Rin gets another chance to defeat him. But Isagi is just baffled. He doesn't understand what he did wrong. But Bachira tells him to get up and get moving, as he's evidently so deep in thought that he completely forgets about his former teammates until he turns around to talk to them. And the trio seem to have already accepted what's happened, telling him to just get going whilst they deal with their frustration, because it's just like Isagi told Nagi after their first defeat, there's nothing that'll get them over that frustration except winning. And so Isagi turns and leaves. As the trio lets out their frustration, whilst Isagi walks on ahead with Bachira, who starts talking about how, with Isagi not around, he learned to fight alone, overcoming his codependency issues, I don't know how else to call it at this stage, but becoming much more comfortable in himself, now wanting to play with Isagi rather than needing to. Then Isagi asks Rin what he was lacking, what Rin had that he didn't. Rin simply replies, luck, much to Isagi's disappointment and our surprise, as he wanted something that he could actually work on. But it's at this point that Jinpachi invites them through to learn about how luck works in the world of football. And again, Jinpachi's little speeches like this are one of my favourite parts of the series. Isagi has no idea what he's talking about, saying that luck is just luck. But Jinpachi refutes this idea, saying that That's just how the defeated explain it away and twist the truth. He then asks one of the best out of context panels in the series. Have you ever been shat on by a pigeon? I'm sure there was other examples he could have used here, but anyway. He talks about how often after it happens there's a bunch more poo on the floor around you, and if you look up, there's often plenty of pigeons there. If you were aware of that, then you could have prevented it. And whilst you can't entirely prevent the bad luck of a random pigeon flying over you and dropping one on you, there are cases where your bad luck was completely avoidable if you knew a bit more, if you did things a little differently. In a football match, there is the inevitable and the coincidental. You can control some things, but not everything. And at the end of that match, when Bachira broke through, just about everyone else had slowed down. It was just Isagi and Rin moving. Isagi predicted the breakthrough and moved to stop it. He did just about everything right. Everyone else simply waited to see where the shot would go. Then if it rebounded, they would respond to that. But Rin kept running forward. Now, no one knew where this deflection would go, or that there would even be a deflection. If Bachira scored, nothing would matter. But if he didn't, there were two possibilities. If the ball came far back, Rin wouldn't have been able to do much with it. He certainly would have been able to score from there. The defenders would all jump on him before he got a chance. But by positioning himself in front of them, he was able to score. Essentially, he looked for a way to make the most out of a bad situation. Rather than lamenting bad luck or simply being at his mercy, he looked to exploit it. To Jinpachi, this is the proper frame of mind when it comes to handling coincidence, and I completely agree. It's not always easy to push those other circumstances beyond your control out of your mind, but there really is no point dwelling on them. You just gotta do what you can. And with that, we move into the final episode of the season, the 5v5 against 5 of the best strikers in the world, including Julian Loki, someone the same age as Isagi, but already playing for the French national team. And we're about to see just how wide the gap between him and the best strikers in the world really is. And it really gives kind of credit to Jinpachi and the reason he made Blue Lock in the first place, you know? But again, we're going to come back to that because the next part wasn't shown in the anime, but I really don't know why, given that it's pretty significant and it's before Jinpachi's announcement of the U20 match. If you really do want to skip it in case the anime does actually decide to show it at some point, then I'll put a timestamp, but you already know how it ends, and you know, 4 episodes into season 2 and they haven't shown any signs of showing this, so I'm going to include it here anyway. We cut back to Ryo and Kunigami, descending the stairs to their last chance, the cliff edge 2v2. But when they walk into the room, they find Shidou beating up everyone who doesn't agree to play with him. And Igaguri, who he's partnered up with, mentions that in the previous game he actually got sent off, resulting in their defeat. He then goes to drop an axe kick on Igaguri, and this guy's clearly an absolute nutcase, right? And at this point in time, we know nothing about him besides the number on his shirt, 111, the lowest ranked player that we've seen so far. This is obviously bizarre, looking back, given that the rankings were based on the order that they cleared that mini selection. But given that Isagi only had 5 minutes left and was ranked 15th, it seems like it's just based on the order that they started, rather than the actual speed at which they finished. So I guess Shidou likes being the last one through the door based on the overly dramatic scene of him entering later on. I don't know. Also, it's quite funny that Tokimitsu ranks so highly despite being so sort of like nervous and scared, yet he was clearly one of the first ones through the door. Anyway, Kunigami blocks his kick and his second kick, causing Shidou to challenge him. And I don't know if he'd already heard of Kunigami from Igaguri at some point, given that he calls him a hero, or he's just referring to how he stepped in to save him. But Kunigami, understandably, doesn't want to play against a psycho. But Ryo is fully up for it. Ryo claims that because his teammate is Igaguri, the chances of them losing are pretty low, which is obviously complete nonsense, but I suppose he only saw him in the Team Z vs Team V game, so doesn't understand how good he really is. And this time, I'm actually not joking. They really are underestimating him this time. And so with that, the match is decided, and Shidou is just an absolute beast. You know, in the first minute, barging into Kunigami and causing him to lose possession, Igaguri gets the loose ball, and Ryo is fully convinced he's got Igaguri caught, but as soon as he sticks his foot out, Igaguri suddenly throws himself at him, launching himself over his leg. Whoever's refereeing calls out a foul, which is an interesting point. I don't know if it's automated or if there's someone there. That's probably a question for Akira if you're listening. But anyway, Ryo protests, and for good reason, that it wasn't actually a foul. This is Igaguri's new weapon, to draw out fouls from people. And a lot of people hate him for this, and I do completely understand that. However, whilst I plan to go into more detail on this on a separate video for him, what I will say for now is that a lot of people have pointed out that this is particularly frustrating for Kunigami, who's obsessed with having a fair game, to now have to play against basically a cheater, right? But I think Ryo being here is also incredibly significant. I'm not denying that Igaguri is playing unfair here, but let's not forget where Ryo has come from, having every unfair advantage imaginable of his upbringing, having the talent to get into Blue Lock in just 6 months. Igaguri is staking his life on this match. The opinion of someone like Ryo is irrelevant to him in comparison to his fear of going back to the temple. I doubt he likes using these dirty tactics, he just has nothing else. He's a man fighting in whatever way he possibly can, and this is the only weapon he has. But anyway, more on that in a separate video. Shidou has Kunigami and Ryo completely figured out already. He knows Kunigami's mid-range shot and Ryo's well-roundedness are their strengths, and he has the skill to exploit it. He also claims that, unlike Ryo and Kunigami, who are just playing football to be a hero or to escape boredom, are simply incomparable to him, who sees it as a battle of life and death. Shidou's overhead kick makes it 1-0, and it dawns on Ryo and Kunigami what an awful spot they're in. The manga then jumps back to the World 5 match, but just to finish this off quickly, when we next see Kunigami, he's alone on the pitch. Shidou walks away after picking Ryo, and Kunigami is eliminated, making him the first major side character to leave the Blue Lock project, unless you count Kira, I suppose, but anyway. No idea why that, or the little scene following it, which I won't mention here, isn't included in the anime, but returning to the World 5 match, and it's a real shock for the gang to see players that they've watched on TV stand on the same pitch as them. However, they aren't taking them seriously, to say the least. Right? Not all of the Blue Lock players speak English, so they can't understand what's being said, but it's pretty obvious they're laughing at them. Rin, however, does, and directly challenges them. But when his brother is brought up, despite it being in quite a complimentary way, praising the pair of them, Rin's demeanor completely changes. The game kicks off and Blue Lock are able to slip past their defenses, batter crosses to Rin, who makes it 1-0, and at this point it genuinely does seem as though Blue Lock may be able to challenge them. The training has paid off and they've reached this insane level that they could only dream of before. The World 5 does show some genuine surprise and respect for their skills, but the reality soon reveals itself. They really were just underestimating them. Loki immediately blazes past Isagi. Rin intercepts him with a brilliant bit of English, which I just have to play.
Your road is to office.
I love it when anime does that. But anyway, Rin doesn't come close to matching Loki's speed, who makes it 1-1. And the rest of the goals are equally one-sided. Just about everyone in the World 5 is basically an upgraded version of someone on the other team, using the same weapon, but at a much higher level. But Isagi just finds himself in admiration, and it's a small moment lasting only a couple seconds, but it's one that really defines his journey. When he first saw Barou, he was overwhelmed and doubted his position in Blue Lock. When he first saw Rin, the difference in skill frustrated him, it even scared him a little. But now with that same absurd gap, he only looks on in awe, knowing that there's no reason he can't reach it. So it just excites him rather than frustrates him. And I really do love that. I think it's absolutely the right way to look at things, you know. But anyway, The World 5 effortlessly make it 4-1, and 4 of the Blue Lock 5 have accepted that they just can't win this. They're not overly frustrated by it, as these are professional players after all, and most of them are a lot older as well. But Rin doesn't think that way at all. As pointed out by Luna, he still thinks he can genuinely win this, and it makes sense that he is so desperate to beat these guys given the backstory with his brother, which I won't spoil here, but with his brother already being a pro, he's been aiming for that target this whole time. To lose here like this is especially frustrating for him, as it just reaffirms the gap between them, much like the gap between his legs that Luna nutmegs the ball through. The World 5 reveal that they never expected him to win, it was just to test their abilities, and interestingly, Luna says lumps of talent, the same phrase which Jinpachi has used a few times. But I doubt there's anything significant there, it was probably just from when Jinpachi spoke to them before this match. But anyway, with a 5-1 defeat and even Rin being completely humiliated, the gap between the players in Blue Lock and the rest of the world strikers is extremely clear. They have a long way to go, and even Blue Lock, in a way, is a bit of a small pond. Of course, they are all very young and improving very quickly, but regardless, it's a real eye-opener for both them and us, as neither previously had any idea how well they stacked up against the rest of the world. And on that note, they spend the time waiting for the other teams learning English, which Rin is evidently pretty solid at already, which is probably for the exact same reason Ego wants them to learn it, to be able to play abroad, right? But anyway, after that reminder about the world outside Blue Lock, we get the rest of the teams progressing through, with Chiguri, Nagi and Barou's team being the first, followed by a bunch of new characters that we've not seen yet, and as the rest of the teams pour in, with some familiar faces like Raichi and Gagamaru, we're down to just one team left to enter, with both Kunigami and Ryo still not being here. The first one through is Igaguri, presumably due to the whole team agreeing he was the MVP, although I have to say, in the shot where we can see Ryo, why does he look so scary here? There was absolutely no reason for this. But anyway, with 4 of the final team revealed, there's just one player remaining, with Isagi silently praying that it would be Kunigami. But Shidou walks through, telling Isagi that he was the one who sent him down to hell. But it's at this moment that Jinpachi interrupts, bringing up a concern that likely hadn't even entered anyone's minds until now, that Blue Lock itself could vanish. He says he planned to narrow it down to just 5 players. At this point, at the start, he mentioned that 5 strikers would join the Japanese national team, but the plan has changed. Japan's football higher-ups want to shut down Blue Lock, so Jinpachi gave them a challenge. In 3 weeks, Blue Lock will face off against the U20 team. If they win, they'll hijack the team for themselves. Obviously, the higher-ups accepted this in spite of the crazy stakes, as they thought there was no chance of them losing to a bunch of high school strikers, which is understandable, honestly. If Blue Lock loses, it will be the end of the project, the end of this attempt to reinvent Japanese football. But Jinpachi, who's shown to be correct time and time again, states that they can do this. Not encourages, but outright states that they can shake up Japanese football. But there's one final twist. Despite his previous disapproval towards the Japanese team, Sai Itoshi will join them. Our best guess at this point is that it was due to him wanting to see the Blue Lock project up close. They have just 3 weeks to prepare, and as Isagi points out, it's kind of mind-blowing that most of them have gone from complete nobodies to fighting against their country's U20 team. And the match itself is probably my second favorite arc in anything. It's insanely hype. I really hope that what we've seen of Season 2 so far doesn't continue into that. I'd be very upset if it does, but that concludes Season 1's content. So if you made it all the way here to the end of this 2-hour video, thank you very much. Please do leave a comment and let me know what you thought. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Chances are you're probably in the middle of doing something and putting something in the background, so hopefully that's going well, and see you soon for that Igaguri video.